surrounded by handsome men.
So Frank, why don't we start with you? We did have the opportunity to have a few conversations about where we're going with this panel, and let's save the highfalutin literary criticism for later, and let's start with just a facts the account. What have you turned up in your biographical and bibliographical researches that bears on our subject? And I'll just let you do what you will with that.
Okay. Can you hear me? All right. I'm going to try to hold it like this and just talk normally. I didn't necessarily turn up anything. This is fairly well-known information, but just for the benefit of those of you who don't know all these details, the book, The Man in the High Castle, was published 1962. This is the original book club edition. Nice photo of him in the back. This was what it looked like. Philip K. Dick was born in 1928. World War I started for the U.S. in 1941, and World War II, 1941. So when he was writing this book, essentially in 1961, that was 20 years ago. He was looking back when he was in high school, basically, or in junior high then. And so that was kind of his world. He read the newspaper. He kept track of the course of the war as it went on. And then around 1960, what had happened in the post-war era was really remarkable. If you think about it, Japan, Italy, and Germany had pretty much been pacified. They had gone, a small chunk of the East Bloc in Germany are kind of on the Russian side, but they had been pacified, and everybody else from the Axis had pretty much fallen into the orbit of the West. And there wasn't a resistance, there wasn't, political turmoil for the most part within those countries. And so I think what he did was turn that on its head and say, well, what if we had this alt history that went the other way? And the concept of an alternate history was well known to him. This issue of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction contained his story, The Little Movement, which is one of his earliest stories, was actually the first published in fantasy and science fiction. This is November 1952. That was the first year he was published professionally, and he sold his first story, Rube, to the editors. And this issue contained a very long story called Bring the Jubilee, which was premised on the idea that the South had won the Civil War. And so he had this, not this issue in his hand, but he had this magazine very much in hand, and he immediately wrote back to his editors, kind of arguing the issues involved in it. So the very concept of what if a major historical event had gone completely differently was very well known to him, and in fact, he went on to write a similar, though much different thing. And what a big thing that made it different was, as Ted had said, the I Ching. In 1950, this was published. This is a later version of it, like a second printing of it. I've got this out from the library. It was from a series, the Bollingen series of books that were mainly publishing Carl Jung in English, as far as I know. I'm not at all an expert on the subject, but Anne Dick, Phil Dick's third wife, apparently was into Carl Jung and collected this series. And so if you read in the novel, it talks about a black 2-volume, they call it the Oracle, but it's the I Ching. This is basically what he would have had in hand. Later, I think after he left Anne, Bill Cyril was the main source of it. He said that the version of the I Ching he had was still this, but a later printing where it was 1 volume, and maybe...
Is that the Wilhelm Baines?
Yes, Wilhelm Baines. It's a translation, it's an English translation, Richard Wilhelm translation, rendered into English by Carrie F. Baines. So it's a translation of a translation of the Chinese, and I'm not at all an expert on this book, but it's obviously so old that there's so much commentary on top of commentary on type of commentary. It'd be like a Bible. It's like what exact commentary on a Bible. There's an ancient tradition of how to read it, things like that, like maybe the Talmud or something like that. That's how deep in Chinese culture that is. And so with one other point, back to Anne Dick and that time period, he moved with his wife, his second wife, Cleo, from Berkeley in 1958 to West Marin County. It's Marin County, but it's an area on the coast. It's kind of isolated from the rest of the county. It's very rural, at least in comparison. And he moved there in 1958, and almost immediately met Anne Dick, or Anne Rubenstein at the time, who was a recent widow. Her husband, Paul, I think, Richard Rubenstein, had died. He was a poet. He had died in according to Anne, it was from an allergic reaction to psychiatric medication, something like that. And so she was a widow. She had 3 children. Philip Dick met her, and within weeks, say, they were together, and he left Cleo.
Was she blonde?
Anne was.
Anne was. That's what I thought, because I see the pictures. She looked like she was blonde. He always goes on about the dark-haired girl, But he was she was blonde.
Yeah. So that was the period of life he was in. That was in 1959, where he essentially went on and left Cleo, married Anne. His first daughter, Laura, was born sometime after that. 1960. And so added to the three children, I think all 3 girls. They had a household of 4 young girls, and
just like the Brady Bunch.
And yes, and so suddenly he was the head of the household, and during the last 5 years or so, Dick had tried to change the outlook of his career from these science fiction books with I don't have examples, but you know what the covers looked like, and the Ace books with the
Bug-eyed monsters.
With the bug-eyed monsters, the early books like
And
Solar.
Years.
Right. He had for years after that tried to convert to a career writing mainstream novels, and he'd occasionally write something like Vulcan's Hammer, which was an expansion of one of his earlier longer stories. But the main thing he was working on was trying to sell these mainstream novels, and he did get a fair amount of interest from publishers. He just never sold them. And he literally wrote, I think, 9 of them between his last science fiction novel that he wrote from scratch, other than Time Out of Joint, which is very much a hybrid, he wrote 9 mainstream novels that he was not able to sell. 3 of them are no longer in existence. The other 6, including Confessions of a Crap Artist, have all since been published, most after his death.
No, it was 12 and 9.
But there were a few before then. Just imagine going through and writing 9 pretty much in a row and not being able to sell them. That was the state he was at when he was trying to write this, and he was under some financial pressure just because he was suddenly had these children to support. And simultaneously, Anne was developing this jewelry business. I'm actually going to pull out a prop on that. These are not from the 1960s, but these are actual antique jewelry pieces that I just picked up from eBay. This became a very thriving business, especially after Anne and Philip Dick were divorced. She supported her family with this business, and she did soldering and melting metal, and that was just sort of the style. And she did these elaborate jewelry, necklace pieces, things like that. You can type in Anne Dick jewelry into eBay, and you'll see all sorts of stuff come up. It was a very, very successful business, but she was just starting that out then, and the elements of the jewelry business that are in this book are straight from that experience, because there's a salamander thing like that. This was more of a reindeer. So those are sort of biographical elements that went into that. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that's great to get us started here.
Yeah.
So when Dave told me that he thought Man in the High Castle is Dick's first masterpiece, I sort of did a double take, because if you're familiar with David Gill's work, he wrote his master's thesis on another book, which Frank's already mentioned, Time Out of Joint. And I thought, what, not Time Out of Joint? Right? What's the deal? Like, why would Man in the High Castle be, considered the first masterpiece? And it's interesting that the Time Out of Joint, as Frank said, is a bit of a hybrid novel, right? And we can compare Valis as well, right? Where there's a lot of elements, and Umberto Rossi has done some great literary critical work on Valis, on how a lot of the book is really a straight novel, right? And we see, Dick at the height of his powers in writing a mainstream novel for a lot of that, before the science fictional element sort of breaks into the book in a typical, Dickian, I don't know if I want to call it a divine invasion, but there's certainly an element of interruption there. So I'm very interested in this question. I personally have always considered Time Out of Joint to be, way up there, maybe in my top 5 or top 10 of Dick's novels, and I would consider it to be his first masterpiece. Incredibly, groundbreaking book, and it's been ripped off in the movies so many times with like the Truman Show, for example. I've always considered it such a foundational text. So we do have the benefit of somebody who knows a little bit about literature in Andrew Butler. So I'd like to hear what you think about Time Out of Joint and Man in the High Castle, this question of which is Dick's first masterpiece. And I believe that Frank has some thoughts on this subject too.
I could be controversial and say neither, which possibly means things. I might make a call for Eye in the Sky. It's more straightforwardly generic science fiction. The interest in that novel, which is so fiendishly cleverly structured, is how you read the ending. And I think Paul Williams reprinted it in one of the newsletters. There was an afterword, I think it was a foreword to the novel, which is written by the characters of the novel, where they talk about the novel. And we're obviously in spoiler territory with virtually everything we say here. but at the ending you're assuming they've returned to base reality, but I'm not convinced we have. In particular, there's some civil rights politics that feel different at the end of the book compared to the start. So I think there's a case to be made for Time at the Joint being the first masterpiece in terms of that synthesis with, for want of a better word, realism, a term I used to know what it meant, but the longer I look at literature, the less sure I know what it means. And it's got some lovely little details. On the first page of the novel, there's a car drives past the character, I think it's called Anne Hawthorne, and that will be Anne Rubinstein and Dick with a kind of walk and park. And the motor car is a Tucker motor car, which was Francis Ford Coppola made a movie about the car designer, and it was a fantastic car that never really went into production. So it's almost as if there's a DeLorean motor car being driven past. So there's that little hint on the first page of it being science fictional. And then you've got that one by one moments of oddness. And now, I'm not going to misremember the detail of the novel here. Is there a scene in which he reaches for a light switch which isn't there? And I've had that experience so many times. It's sort of kind of things like deja vu, and a couple of years ago I went to Winchester to give a talk, actually on Philip K. Dick, and at Winchester is King Arthur's Round Table, honest. And I remember going to see that 30 years ago, and it was often quite a busy road, and I went through the door from the road into the merchant's hall where the round table is, and it was immediately on your right as you went in. So I went there last year. The medieval building which that round table is a good 100 yards from where it was 30 years ago, and the round table's on your left. I said to the person on the ticket desk, did you used to come into this building from the other side? No, there's the barracks there. And yet I have this really kind of solid memory. And it's that kind of doubting yourself, memories of things that didn't happen, that he does so beautifully in Time at the Joint. And whilst I think Man in the High Castle is a better book, I don't think it has the same number of moments where I connect with the novel in that sense of you're trying to remember the quote. There's always this sense that the Philip K. Dick novel reads you. It kind of turns you inside. Certainly things like Valis, there's that. Or I reread Do Andrew's Dream for the first time in a few years. When you get to the alternative police station, and they say to Deckard he's a replicant, or he's an android. And I'd forgotten the rest of the novel at that point. I hadn't read it for a few years. I thought, oh, was it? So there's all these moments of being disconcerted by this novel that you don't quite get in the same way in Man in the High Castle. Rereading the novel, admittedly very quickly early in the week, I'm struck by how much info dumping there is in this novel. And I suppose that is one of the problems I had with Valis the last time I reread it. Obviously, clearly did lots of research. I think there were various Nazi war trials in Nuremberg around about the time he was writing the novel. So it would have been in the news as well.
The big event at the time, and I meant to mention that, was Israel had kidnapped Adolf Eichmann And the trial was going on in 1961 when he was writing it, so that was very much in the news. The famous articles by, and later book by Hannah Arendt had not been published, so don't go down the path of thinking he had read that. They weren't published until 1962 around, at least in magazine form when this came out, but it was very much in the news and there was a lot of interest in the subject of the Nazi era.
But to kind of finish my point, you get this sense of he's done the research, so he's going to put it in the novel. And obviously, a lot of that research is kind of, he's then faked it, hasn't he? So,
Yeah.
so he's taken the history and he's rewritten it.
Yeah, another thing, and he lists his sources in the book, and I don't think this is recognized enough. He says, I made much use of The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, History of Nazi Germany, by William Shirer, which was published in 1960, a very thick, very popular book published in the US, and a lot of the portraits of the Nazis in this book, I think, are very much consistent with that book, and sort of the machinations of the way the Nazi politics worked.
My turn? Okay, I'll step outside the box and look for the man whose teeth were all exactly alike. It's actually a critique of the poor management of the public water utility in Marin County. The water was polluted and people were drinking it and bathing in it. And if you remember, the teeth of the supposed Neanderthal skull turned out to be a modern human who had been drinking the local water. And Phil drew, for this novel, he drew upon Ibsen's play, An Enemy of the People, for many of the elements in his novel. As far as The Man in the High Castle goes, it's a great novel, but not his first great novel. He used to say that the Nazis really did win the war, even though Germany lost. The Nazis just moved on to other places in the world that had more resources, more what they would consider disposable people, bigger populations of poor people they could use and abuse, and natural resources that they just didn't have in Germany. And of course there's obviously Werner von Braun and his friends in NASA, but there were a lot more Nazis brought here and elsewhere, and a lot of Nazis in South America where they were quite welcome. Dictators loved them. There's even a current researcher, Dr. Joseph P. Farrell, has found or dug up evidence that even Bormann and Goebbels were alive in Argentina in at least as recently as the 1960s. So for Phil, The Man in the High Castle was literally true. It's a metaphor for the way the Nazis infiltrate and take over without firing a shot. Got another question?
So one of my questions for you